Hello, and welcome to Allies, a series of videos where we talk about Ukraine's friends and try to understand how the war in Ukraine impacted their domestic and foreign policies, their societies, and economies. We also want to know how far their support for Ukraine goes and how long we can expect it to last. Today, joining us is Peter Rutland, a friend and professor of Russian and Eastern European Studies at Wesleyan University. Professor Rutland has been an observer of the Soviet Union and Russia for more than 30 years, and his research focuses on nationalism, Russian politics, and Eastern European affairs. Welcome, Professor.
Hello, Dmytro.
Arguably, the US has been an indispensable partner for Ukraine since 2014 that has provided more assistance to Ukraine than any other state, including military support. The Ukrainian government and people appreciate the position of the United States, including during this stage of the war, and it is the United States that coordinates the pro-Ukrainian coalition that has been meeting at the Ramstein base in Germany. Inside the US, however, it seems that there is some instability. Inflation has been increasing, and Biden's approval rating is rather low. The US has two major parties, and so far Ukraine has enjoyed bipartisan support. However, there are multiple factions within these parties, and our viewers would hugely benefit from learning about their attitudes and how their views are evolving in the current context. President Biden, of course, has long been at the forefront of US policy towards Ukraine, including as Obama's vice president. Still, a year ago, Ukraine was wondering why Biden did not visit, and even the supply of portable anti-air missiles such as Stinger seemed off the table. Now the US is supplying Ukraine with howitzers and possibly multiple large rocket systems, arms that are advanced and can have a major influence of the outcome of the war. We want to understand if this support can be sustainable and what made the United States adopt a more aggressive stance, given that Biden was actively negotiating with Putin last year. So I guess that's where we start. We'll take a look at the pre-war situation. And the first question is, given that the US officials knew that the invasion was coming, they were reluctant to supply additional weapons before the start of the invasion. But after it began, it seemed that the supply increased dramatically, both in quantity and quality. Why is that?
Well, I think before the invasion, the US government was wary of Russia. They didn't like the Putin regime, but they thought that Russia was a marginal issue compared to the rise of China. And there was much more concern in the Biden administration, as there was in the Trump and Obama administrations, to pivot from Europe to Asia and to focus on the economic and strategic threat coming from China. So the Biden administration thought, okay, Russia's not going to change, but it's not going to do anything to destabilize Europe. We've learned to live with Russia, kind of thing. That was the mentality going into 2021. So the question of why was the US reluctant to send weapons before and then suddenly changed, pivoted, and started sending a lot more sophisticated weaponry into Ukraine? Yes, that was a dramatic about turn in the course of 2021. And I think the US was responding to what the US intelligence was finding about the Russian military buildup around Ukraine. So Biden was hoping that there would be a modus vivendi with Russia, that we would just basically leave Russia alone and Russia would leave its neighbors alone. And the Biden administration wanted to focus on the threat from China, the perceived threat, economic and security threat from China. But in his first year in office, Biden was not allowed to do that because Russia stepped up the pressure on Ukraine, the troops gathering on the border, President Putin's July 2021 article where he seemed to be denying Ukraine a right to exist as a sovereign state. Those actions set off alarm bells in the White House. And so the US policy in the second half of 2021 pivoted towards a recognition that this war may well happen and that Ukraine will need better weaponry to try and defend itself in the event that Russia does actually attack.
I guess one follow-up to that is that still, with this recognition in mind, before the war, there was a pretty scarce supply. I think it was maybe some javelins, maybe some stingers. So moving on to the second question, perhaps as it is perhaps related to that, what we're looking at really is that the analysis before the war was that Ukraine would only hold out from maybe 72 hours to 3 weeks. And now we see that these scenarios did not come to fruition. So I guess the question is, do you think that the less active supply of weapons before the war was related to the lack of confidence by the United States that Ukraine could defend itself?
I think the reluctance to send more weapons into Ukraine earlier on in the Trump administration and even in the Obama administration was due to a fear that those weapons would be used to start a more active war over Donbass, that Ukraine would take those weapons and use them to try and recapture Donbass. So I think that was the initial reason for the US being cautious about sending weapons, right? And there were even some limits on when they started sending javelins, they wouldn't let them be taken to the front line in Donbass kind of thing. But that changed in 2021 when with this Russian military buildup, there was no longer a worry that Ukraine was going to attack Donbass. The worry was that Russia was going to attack Ukraine. I don't know what the internal debates were in the US. I think there was, it's been publicly stated that they did think that Russia would win the war very quickly, but still they were sending Ukraine advanced weapons in the hope that that wouldn't be the case. So I don't think if the US administration had kind of written off Ukraine, they wouldn't have sent any weapons at all. So I think they did start to send weapons thinking Putin is serious, but the Ukrainians have a chance of stopping him. And so let's give it a try kind of thing.
So how has this analysis of Ukraine's ability to defend itself changed now that the Ukraine has been resisting the invasion for, well, arguably more than 3 months at this point? And what indicators would you say are being used to assess Ukraine's performance?
Obviously, in any war, the information is not reliable. We don't get all the information that we would need to really assess how the war is going. But we do have satellite surveys. We have a lot of social media reports, videos on the ground. And there are hundreds of Western journalists in Ukraine who are reporting from the front lines. So I think we're reasonably confident in the picture that we have, which is that the Russian drive to capture Odessa, Kharkiv, Kiev failed, but that Russia has succeeded in taking that huge swathe of territory in southern and southeastern Ukraine. So I think the picture is clear that there were significant victories for the Ukrainian forces in pushing back the Russians from Kiev and Kharkiv. What we don't know are the level of losses on both sides. We have kind of better information about the Russian losses than about the Ukrainian losses, because the Ukrainian government, for obvious reasons, has been keen to get the news out that a lot of Russian armor is being destroyed and has not been willing to share information about the Ukrainian losses. So there's some question marks over the manpower issue about how many fighting soldiers each side can keep at the front. That's something which is still unknown. So now the debate has shifted from, is Ukraine going to lose the war very quickly? The debate now is how long is the war going to go on, and can either side really achieve victory over the other side? And at what point do they have to start negotiating about peace?
I guess one question I have here is that in Ukraine, we all want to see a counteroffensive. We all want to see Russia thrown out of the territories that they were able to capture in the east and southeast the south of the country. So is that something that the United States is considering as a capability by Ukraine, being able to counterattack Russia and recapture those territories?
There's differences of opinion. I think the US opinion from both parties and from the public was pretty united in wanting to help Ukraine avoid being occupied by Russia. So that was the mood for the first days and weeks of the war. And now that worst case scenario of Russia occupying the entirety of Ukraine, now that has been pushed back, at least for now, off the table. The debate now is over what kind of concessions Ukraine can be expected to give in order to secure peace. And there's differences of opinion in the US, that there are some people who say you can never trust Putin, any peace would be temporary, so only a kind of complete victory for Ukraine is viable. And there are others, both among the Democrats and the Republicans, who say that's not realistic. You're never going to be able to defeat Russia, such a huge power with nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So there's going to have to be a compromise. And the compromise, which was kind of floated in the first weeks of the war, was that Russia would keep Crimea and Donbass in return for making peace. But as the war has progressed, just as the Ukrainian anger with Russia has escalated, so also the Russian anger with the West and Ukraine has escalated. So it now looks like Putin would not be willing to go back to the status quo as of 23rd of February, that he wants to take off more the entirety of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasti, and also Kherson and Mariupol. And so it's going to be very difficult to find a middle ground that would persuade Putin to stop the war, but also would persuade President Zelensky that this is a price worth paying for peace. So it's very difficult. And I think the US debate now has kind of become more contested, less consensus, because you've got very different points of view about that question.
That's a really good point. But regardless of the state of this debate, we're seeing that the U.S. is kind of getting in with the support for a long haul. Namely, the lend-lease is the only long-term commitment that Ukraine secured so far from its partners. And here the question is, how durable do you think this support is? Can the midterm elections impact the lend-lease bill? And what would need to happen for the lend-lease bill to go down?
So far, I think the lend-lease, the $40 billion of aid, which is a huge package, right? It's an enormous amount of money. Even for the US, it's a large amount of money. I don't see the Republicans or Democrats backtracking on that. I think both of them want to show themselves able to stand up to Putin. And also there's consensus on NATO, that this is a test not just for Ukrainian sovereignty, but it's also a test for NATO. If NATO can't protect Ukraine, then the viability of the whole alliance comes into doubt. So I think there's a pretty broad consensus in the US policy spectrum on this program. And sad to say, there's also defense industry interests involved, that this money is spent on weapon systems which are manufactured in the US, so that's jobs for US workers. And so it's very easy to get a consensus in Congress to spend money on the military. It's patriotic and it's beneficial to your home constituencies, to the bottom line in your home state. So that's unfortunate. That goes back through the whole Cold War. There was that kind of consensus. And unfortunately, it left the US, I think, with a very bloated military budget, $800 billion a year. That's more than the next 9 countries combined. So the Ukraine aid has to be seen against that backdrop of this long-standing tradition of the US having a large military. That's just the way the US has conducted itself for the past 80 years or so.
Certainly. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about the different constituencies, the different groups in the US that benefit from the war or are in support of the war later on in this conversation. But for now, another question about lend-lease. It is a non-Ukraine specific bill, meaning that it is meant to support all parties suffering from the war, which by a leap of logic includes NATO member states in Eastern and Central Europe who gave some of their weapons to Ukraine. So when it comes to the equipment supplied under the bill, what do you think is more likely, that most of these funds will go to Ukraine directly, or that they will be distributed among these NATO member states in Eastern and Central Europe to replace the old machinery that they provided to Ukraine? Can we expect the pressure from NATO allies for this kind of priority spending on the replacement of their militaries rather than spending directly on Ukraine?
Yeah, that's the way it's been structured from the beginning, that Poland, Czech Republic, and so on were sending some equipment to Ukraine, like older, even Soviet-era equipment, on the understanding they would be replaced with newer equipment from the US. And the US was perfectly okay with that. It was quicker to get those old systems that were already in place and that maybe Ukrainian military were more familiar with, rather than shipping brand new equipment straight to Ukraine. Although over time, we've seen more of the brand new equipment going into Ukraine than in the first weeks. So yes, it is a program to rebuild those militaries in Eastern Europe. And there's also going to be stepping up of US forces permanently based in Central and Eastern Europe that had gone down to less than 30,000, and now they're planning on having 100,000, I think, permanently based there. So a lot of the benefit from this program will go to the security of all of the eastern flank of NATO, and that's part of what makes the program appealing to the US. So I don't see it as a kind of zero-sum game for Ukraine. I think that Ukraine's interests and NATO's interests generally are aligned at this point.
So just to clarify, why exactly, when you say appealing to the US, what exactly do you mean?
Well, because the US is not just worried about Ukraine, it's worried about Poland, it's worried about the Baltics. So it wants to strengthen the militaries of all of those frontline states. So there'll be no point in sending weapons from Poland to Ukraine and then leaving Poland unable to defend itself if Russia decides to attack Poland to make a land bridge to Kaliningrad, for example, which is a hypothetical scenario, but not a completely unrealistic one. So Poland needs to have its own forces at full readiness.
Understood. You're quite right that it is not just the supply of weapons, but also the kind of political coordination of different NATO countries that are participating in the pro-Ukrainian coalition. So I guess the next question that I have is about this very coalition that the United States has formed. What do you think are the main speed bumps the US is encountering when dealing with all these countries that are formally supporting Ukraine? What are the most active and reliable partners that Ukraine has? Can we expect this united front of countries to last? Or we will be seeing the United States kind of acting more on its own, perhaps?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot more unity than I think anybody would have expected because of the visceral reaction in Europe to the horrors of the war in Ukraine. So that was unexpected turnaround in German policy in particular was very striking. I think the main disagreements or fissures within the NATO alliance are more on the economic side than the military side. And that's to do with the question of sanctions and the fact that the US is an oil and gas exporter, while Europe relies on imports of gas and Russia for 40% of its gas and 25% of its oil comes from Russia. And the spike in global energy prices harms Europe as a net energy importer more than it does the US. So there's a real divergence of interests on the economic front. And so that's where we're seeing the most difficult negotiations with, again, the EU did join in most of the sanctions, shutting out Russia from the SWIFT bank transaction network, seizing the assets of the Russian central bank, closing down companies, Western companies, not selling dual-use technologies to Russia. The EU has been pretty much on board with all of those sanctions. Even non-EU members like Switzerland have joined those sanctions. But on the oil and gas issue, it's going to do such damage to the European economy if they cut off Russian oil and gas that will plunge them into a massive recession. So they're trying to phase in the switching off of Russian oil and gas over the next 6 months to 1 or 2 years. And so that costs a lot of money. They're going to have, Germany is going to have to buy or rent 2 or 3 liquefaction ships to liquefy natural gas. They have to build new facilities to liquefy natural gas. That takes tens of billions of dollars and several years to execute. So in the meantime, they're going to carry on importing some Russian gas. Well, they want to reduce it, hopefully by 2/3 by the end of this year. Similarly for oil, pipeline oil from Russia is going to be cheaper than tanker oil from the Middle East. So there's going to be a premium of $20 or $30 a barrel, multiplied by 3 or 4 million barrels a day. That's a lot of money to pay for Europeans, whereas the US is benefiting from those high oil prices because we export oil. Although, of course, American consumers have to pay more for the gas at the gas station.
This is actually, you're touching on some great points here. And one of the questions we have in Ukraine is that can the US actually help Europe to minimize its dependence on Russian energy sources, particularly gas? So I guess the question is twofold. First is, how realistic do you think is the plan of, for example, Germany, as you said, saying that it will reduce the consumption of Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of the year? And what role can the US play in that process?
Well, the US has declared its willingness to sell more liquefied natural gas to Europe, but it's a market, and most of the gas in the world market comes from Qatar or from Australia. And so the US role is that of a market player. It's not a political decision. It's they'll sell the gas to whoever is willing to pay the highest price for it. And so Europe is in a bidding war with Asia, with China and Japan for the limited supplies of natural gas on the global market. So it boils down to a question of money, that the Europeans will have to invest in these liquefaction, regasification facilities. They'll have to invest in more gas pipelines, because right now the facilities are in Spain and the UK, but the demand is in Germany and the pipelines aren't there to carry the gas into Germany. So it's a matter for the Europeans to kind of figure out for themselves and to invest in. And the question is, nobody wants to spend those billions of dollars if in 6 months' time it turns out that they don't need those facilities. So they're kind of holding back to see how long is this war going to go on. So similarly, in the US, in the oil and gas industry is a boom-bust industry. And in the last bust, a lot of the shale fracking oil and gas companies went bankrupt because they overinvested in new oil and gas fields. And then the price went from $100 to $20 at one point a barrel, and a lot of them went bankrupt. So this time around, that was like back in 2014, 2015. This time around, the investors are much more cautious. They don't want to make the same mistake again, to invest in increasing shale oil and gas output, and then find in 6 months or a year's time, the price is down at $30 a barrel again. they need at least $65 a barrel to be financially viable. So there's a lot of adjustment going on, and it's about the economics. It's not only about the politics. It's also about like who is going to pay for this, and what are the guarantees that we will get our money back. And those are genuine, those are realistic considerations, and so the costs of the Ukrainian war are not just the costs in human lives and the terrible destruction that's being suffered by Ukrainian people, but also these more mundane, more day-to-day calculations about rate of return, risks that businesses do routinely.
Certainly. Another economic question that was particularly raised by the Trump administration was that of the minimal contribution to NATO by member states. As we remember, that's supposed to be 2% of the total GDP. So since the war started, how has this discourse progressed, and how has this discourse progressed in general with the Biden administration?
Yeah, well, this is a long-standing complaint of the US, goes back to the Cold War days, that the US is spending all this money on military security and the Europeans are free riding on Uncle Sam and just not spending very much. They're spending 1% of GDP on defense. Well, back in the Cold War, the US was spending 4%. Now we're spending about 3%. And that extra money went into research and development and improved living standards in Europe. So this is a long-standing complaint of the US. And now I think with the war in Ukraine, the Europeans have got the message. The Germans, Swedes realized they weren't spending enough on defense. They assumed that war was unthinkable, that nobody would attack anybody else in Europe ever again. And they had an abrupt awakening on February 24th when they saw the shells and bombs hitting Ukrainian cities. So right now, out of the 30 NATO members, I think only 8 of them are actually spending at the 2% limit. That's the US, the UK, Greece, and the Baltic countries. So the majority of NATO members are below 2%. France is just below 2%. Usually, historically, France was just about above 2%. But Germany is pledged to get to spend 100 billion euros on rebuilding the military. It's not clear what the time scale for that is, but they're basically pledging to spend more than 2% of GDP. And I don't think any of them are contemplating the reintroduction of the conscription of the draft. Although Sweden, I think, already reintroduced the draft a couple of years ago. So I think the Europeans are serious about this, and the frontline states were certainly serious. And so I think that's an area where the US will find more of a consensus easily with the Europeans than on the economic sanctions issue.
Well, certainly the US has been, in terms of its military spending, much better prepared for a conflict like this. The US is already doing a lot in Ukraine. The question is, can it do more, and under what circumstances? For example, recently we heard a statement from Victoria Nuland, who said that the price would be astronomical for Russia should it use nuclear weapons. So I guess the question is if there are any circumstances where the US could help Ukraine even more. And if we're talking specifically about the weapons of mass destruction, wouldn't it be more prudent by the US to announce the consequences of using these by Russia before it does so? Or should we just take these statements from Victoria Nuland as just as a figure of speech?
Well, there have been various points at which the Ukrainians asked the US to do more. In the first days and weeks of the war, there were demands for a no-fly zone to be implemented by NATO across Ukraine, and the US turned that down. More recently, there have been requests for humanitarian corridors across the Black Sea to let shipping get out with grain supplies from Odessa, which would require some kind of NATO naval presence confronting the Russians. And the US said no to that as well. So I think from the beginning, the US has been trying to draw that red line where direct combat engagement between US or NATO and Russian forces is avoided. And that's tricky, but we've seen that they've also done that in Syria during the civil war in Syria, which was even more complicated than the Ukraine in terms of the number of different parties fighting each other. And Russia and the US at various points were actively involved in combat in Syria with airstrikes and drone strikes on enemy forces. And they did manage to avoid direct conflict between Russian and US troops with a couple of well-known exceptions where Russian mercenaries were hit by NATO strikes. But the two sides do have some experience in making this kind of deconfliction work. And the fear, I think on both sides, is the risks of escalation to nuclear exchanges that both sides want to avoid. Now, onto your question of would it make more sense for the US to specify what would be the quid pro quo? That's kind of never been US policy in nuclear deterrence. It's always been a policy of ambiguity, strategic ambiguity, because if you specify what it is you're going to do, I guess the logic is if you specify what it is you're going to do, that may increase the incentives for the other guy to call your bluff or to do it. So, you know, if you say, if you hit one of our bases, we'll hit one of your bases, Putin might decide, okay, that's a cost we're willing to pay. Let's see if the US is really willing to pay that cost. And then they would hit the US base, you know. Or the Russians could then say, well, again, this is all ex ante, right? If you hit one of our bases, we will hit two of your bases, right? And do you want to start playing that chicken game verbally? You know, so you're kind of front loading the escalation. So I think the logic is better to leave it ambiguous so that Putin doesn't know what the response would be. And also, you know, success in war typically depends on surprising the enemy, not saying what you're going to do, doing something that he doesn't know you're going to do it until you've done it, right? And that worked very well, for example, with the seizure of the Central Bank of Russia's assets abroad. If the US had told Russia, if you invade Ukraine, we will seize all your assets abroad. Well, then Russia would have moved those assets out, right? And that lever would have been thrown away. So I think that ambiguity and keeping the enemy guessing is a good, has some advantages.
Understood. Another question about escalation, as you correctly pointed out, the US is being cautious not to provoke. We're still looking at a situation where the United States is gradually providing more and more complex weaponry to Ukraine, such as the MLRS systems. So the question is, Ukraine being in a defensive war, from a legal standpoint, it has the right to conduct military actions, for example, in Crimea, not just on what has been its controlled territory after 2014. So can this de-escalation or not willingness to escalate affect the future supplies of weapon systems to Ukraine?
Well, yeah, we're seeing that already. The news in the last couple of days is that, you know, the Ukrainians were requesting those long-range rocket systems that could fire 300 kilometers or 500 kilometers, and it looks like the US is not going to send the long-range rocket systems to Ukraine for fear that they could be used to strike Russian bases, if not in Crimea, then in Russia itself. It is tricky, and it is very asymmetrical war where the weapons are being provided, many of them by NATO, the troops are provided by Ukraine. fighting against Russia, where both the troops and the weapons are coming from Russia. So there is this asymmetry. And we had the same thing in World War I and World War II, where at the beginning of the war, the US was sending weapons to the UK, but US soldiers weren't fighting directly. And the problem arose that, German submarines started sinking US vessels crossing the Atlantic that were civilian merchant ships, which had weapons on board. So the Germans said, these are legitimate targets because they're carrying weapons to our enemies. And that's what eventually brought the US into World War I. And a similar story, slightly different in World War II, was the US sanctions on Japan. We stopped selling copper and oil to Japan in 1941. And so the Japanese concluded, well, the only way we can get the resources we need is to invade the Dutch East Indies. And to do that, we need to attack Pearl Harbor, where the US Navy is based. So there is a risk of escalation with sanctions, because from the enemy side's point of view, if the US is providing the weapons, they are effectively a belligerent power. They are effectively partnering with our enemy. And so the friend of my enemy is my enemy too, kind of thing. So that those historical parallels are concerning, So I'm not saying we're getting into World War III, but, the people who got into World War II didn't think they were getting into World War II either. So you have to be careful. And the US leadership, they've made some bad decisions over the years, such as the decision to invade Iraq. But I still have fairly high confidence in the rationality of the US decision makers. So I think they know what they're doing, and I hope that they're on top of all of this and are making the right decisions. But it is very, very difficult situation. I know it's difficult for Ukraine because you're fighting a war against a country that's 3 times bigger than you are. So all the difficulty is always relative. But for the US, there is this risk of escalation, which is balances out against the desire to help Ukraine.
All right, so we talked a lot about the weapon supplies and how the war has been going. And now I want to switch our conversation slightly to the domestic politics of the US and see how things are going on that front in connection to the war between Russia and Ukraine. So what are the attitudes of the two political parties in Ukraine? I guess let's start with Democrats, since they are in power. What kind of factions are there inside the party, and what kind of attitudes they have towards the war?
Well, the mainstream Democratic Party position has always been fairly internationalist, fairly committed to investing in US presence around the globe, spreading American values. Democrats supported humanitarian interventions in the Bosnian War and Kosovo under President Clinton. And so that interventionist tradition has always been pretty strong in the Democratic Party. And Biden represents that tradition. And they were supercharged by the Russian meddling in the 2016 election and the role of Russia in supporting Donald Trump in his rise to power and when he was in power. So the whole scandal around Russia's role in the rise of Donald Trump supercharged that anti-Russian wing of the Democratic Party. So that's the kind of mainstream Democrats. Now, on the progressive wing of the Democrats, the radical left opposed the Iraq war in 2003. They oppose more military spending. They don't want to see the US continuing its Cold War role of the kind of global policeman. Right? They opposed even the drone strike warfare that proliferated under President Obama in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria, and even in Somalia and so on. So the progressive left have opposed many of those wars over the years and don't want to fund a new round of American militarism. So you are hearing some voices from the Democratic left who are calling for a negotiated peace, who are critical of the extent of the US support for Ukraine. But they're in a minority right now in the Democratic Party, but over time, their voices could grow. On the Republican side, it's a different story, that historically the Republicans were also very pro-military, pro-military spending, pro-war. But there is a significant group within the Republican Party who are skeptical of interventionism, and Donald Trump himself was a member of that faction. He didn't want to see the US continuing its involvement in Syria and Afghanistan, and was his team that negotiated the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so that Trump wing of the Republican Party is critical of intervening in foreign conflicts. Added to which, some of them admire President Putin as a strong man, as a traditional values figure. And so there's a significant group within the Republican Party, mostly those who supported Donald Trump, who don't want to see US involvement in the war in Ukraine. And when the $40 billion aid package was going through the Senate and the House of Representatives, there were, I think, 68 Republicans who voted against. It's about 20% of the Republican Party in Congress was voting against the aid package. And there are some well-known commentators, such as Tucker Carlson on Fox News, who are espousing this view that this war is a mistake, that the US should not be supporting Ukraine. And so that's the main concern, I think, for Ukraine, is that those Republican voices that are skeptical about intervention will continue to grow as the war drags on. And there are elections coming up in the fall of this year, which right now Democrats control the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, and they're likely to lose control of either the Senate or the House in November. So we will see a bigger platform for Republicans as time goes on.
Curiously, it was under the Trump administration the US started supplying Ukraine with lethal weapons. So, should we imagine this in 2024, Trump gets reelected? Do you think that he would stick with this opinion of people in the Senate who support him, or would he be more aggressive?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's difficult to imagine 2024 with Trump getting reelected again. I think that's a nightmare scenario for many Americans. And he was so erratic in office that it's difficult to predict where his mind would be in 2024. So I can't even speculate on what he would do. As I say, the Republican Party is deeply split, and there are some, currently a majority of the Republicans who are very much standing up for Ukraine and who think that it's a just cause. And there's also, as I said earlier in our conversations, the logic of military spending is that every congressperson likes to see defense dollars coming to factories in their district. So there's a very strong self-interest in voting for the military budget. So I think that deep logic will continue to prevail, I think, over the vagaries of the Trump wing of the Republican Party, but very hard to predict. And also, of course, there may be changes in Russia. So Putin is not going to live forever. So, lots of things could change between now and November 2024.
Understood. One issue that might play against the Democrats in this election is the rising inflation in the United States. So the question is whether you believe that this inflation is related to the war in Ukraine, is related to the issues on the global markets that the war is causing. And also, how is it played politically? Is it played by Republicans, for instance, to say that it's the inefficient governments by the Democrats that's leading to this inflation?
Yeah, the inflation is real. It's like 8.5% right now, and this it goes back to COVID, I think, and the supply chain problems of COVID that caused also a huge spike in housing prices and rentals. So this has been going on for some time. There's worries about inflation, and yeah, the Republicans will use it as a stick to beat the Democrats, and economic issues do dominate in American elections. You know, it's unusual, very unusual for foreign policy to play any role in US elections. It's just very, very rare. And so the economy is a big problem, and the economy is growing, and unemployment is low. So that's good. But the inflation is high. And so this is why the Democrats are afraid that they're going to get beaten up badly at the ballot box in November. To what extent, you know, the average voter kind of sees the connections between the war in Ukraine and the global gas price, the war in Ukraine and the grain supplies and the food prices. You know, that's quite a complicated causal chain there. And food prices globally were going up before the Ukraine war, right? There were all kinds of supply chain problems and drought in many parts of the world that were causing something like a 25% increase in food prices before the Ukraine war. So the interruption of grain output from Ukraine and Russia and fertilizer output from Russia is adding on to it already critical trends in global food chain. To what extent average voters know about all of that and kind of attribute blame, and to what extent the Republicans are trying to pin the blame on Biden, we'll have to see. I think it's fairly easy for Republicans to point the finger at Biden because he's the president, the buck stops here. So whatever the causal explanation, the Republicans will probably get some advantage out of it. I mean, the main problem for the Democrats, though, is just that Biden is not a very attractive figure. He's not very popular. He's frankly too old to be a dynamic, charismatic president. And people voted for him because Trump was worse. But, you know, Trump isn't going to be on the ballot. Well, Biden is not going to be on the ballot in November either, but Biden is the figurehead of the Democratic Party, and he's not helping Democratic candidates. So that's a specific problem for the Democrats that is going to probably tip one or other or both of the congressional houses to the Republicans.
Certainly. So now that we touched a little bit upon the impact of the war on the domestic affairs of the U.S., I want to ask you about the impact of the war on foreign policy. As you said before, China was a priority of the United States. How has war changed that?
Well, it's certainly complicated it because the China problem has not gone away, as it were. China's actions in the South China Sea and threats towards Taiwan continue. The Chinese military buildup, where its navy is now larger than the US Navy, has been many years in the making. Also, China's role is important in the sanctions regime on Russia, because China and India are buying a lot of the oil and in future gas, which the Europeans are not buying. So they're providing an alternative market for Russia. And it's also possible that China, and for that matter, Turkey, will be a backdoor for Russian corporations to import equipment that they can't buy directly from the Europeans or the Americans. They'll buy it through third parties in Turkey or China. So the US has got to focus its attention on China to make sure it doesn't undermine the sanctions against Russia. And you know, the US legislation does allow for secondary sanctions on third parties who are breaking the sanctions, can be subject to sanctions. So a lot of the big Chinese companies are worried they may be shut out of the US market if they break the Russia sanctions. So we're not going to see the Huawei's and the Lenovo's breaking the sanctions, because the American market is like 10 times more important for them than the Russian market. But we will see smaller companies, kind of below the radar companies, will be buying and selling to evade the sanctions. So that's another complication in the US-China relationship. Another thing to worry about is trying to pressure China not to become the back door to Russia.
The last question, and thank you for this conversation. I think our viewers benefited hugely from it. But the last question we have for you, which is something usually beyond our scope, but we couldn't help but ask you as an expert on Russian politics. What do you think about the ability of Russia to change? If Putin departs tomorrow, in a month, in a year, what would Russia look like? Would power dynamics change? Would it be Putin's people who would get the power? Would Russia stop the war? What do you think about that?
Well, only time will tell. I started studying Russia when it was still the Soviet Union and when it looked like nothing would ever change. It looked very, very rigid system. I lived there for 6 months in 1982, at the height of the Brezhnev era, when the death of Leonid Brezhnev, and it looked like nothing would change. And within 5 years, everything changed. So the same thing could happen again. Right now, it's very hard to see forces for change inside Russia. The political system is very rigid, very tightly controlled. But history has shown that it can change very rapidly in unexpected ways. So that's the best I can do. Short run, pessimism, long run, optimism. That some kind of new Russia can be reborn. I'm not sure when. I'm not sure who will be in charge, but it's possible. But in the short to medium term, it's a very gloomy scenario. And a lot of the people who Putin has surrounded himself with are even more ruthless and nationalist than Putin himself. So it's possible that the replacement for Putin won't be any better than Putin from the point of view of the West. But so this is a long haul game. It's a long haul. It's a matter of years, decades, not a matter of months. And I think Ukraine, having survived 30 years of independence, understands this very well, that it's a long-term problem.
Well, your suggestion that things might change more radically than we can predict them to is a good positive note to end this conversation on. Thank you once again for being with us. Thank you for your great insights. We invite our viewers to subscribe to this channel to learn more about how other friends of Ukraine are treating Ukraine. I remind you that today Peter Rutland was with us. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.